cranial nerve number 10, dropping down over here, is your major nerve for your so-called parasympathetic innervation of all these organs. So when we talk about these two divisions, the parasympathetic one, mostly we're going to be talking about this vagus nerve right here. Right? So when we're comparing basically our sympathetic versus parasympathetic, because they're going to target a lot of the same organs, mainly it's their parasympathetic that we're comparing it to. And maybe some of your other ones down there, as we'll see, but mostly this is a big one, 75%. Again, what controls that cranial nerve number 10? It gets its input from the hypothalamus, which is also sends its axons down and controls oculomotor neuron 3, 7, and 9 over here, right? So that is where the control of it is, just like your primary motor cortex. Those neurons that were controlling your thumb are controlling your thumb up in the precentral cortex. These neurons are controlling the output of these nerves right here, right? The visceral component of it. Right? And then we'll see, right, the other nuclei in your hypothalamus are going to be going down, deeper down into the spinal cord to control the so-called sympathetic division. And then also way down at the other end of the spinal cord, this other part of your parasympathetic division. So there's your control over these cranial nerves. So somatic versus visceral. We learned about this H-shaped gray matter, right? This is where your motor nuclei of your spinal cord was. These, remember, this is where your motor, your neurons, cell bodies, and your gray matter are, right? This outside here was all axon. So in there, we had distinct regions of this so-called like this H-shaped things. In the dorsal area, you had the sensory stuff. And that was divided into information coming from somatic stuff, like your skin, basically, and your visceral stuff, your guts, right? Your internal organs. And then on the ventral side, you had the ventral and the lateral horn, the visceral motor neurons. So just to compare, make these red. Where do they send their axons? Out here to skeletal muscle. Whereas these guys here in the visceral, the cell bodies were here, they also send their axons out here. They were going to visceral targets, right? Maybe that was your heart, maybe that was a smooth muscle, something like that, right? So somatic and visceral, right? Different kind of locations of those. So I've been talking about motor. And when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, we're only talking about the motor, really. So just to make, some books do kind of, talk about them the same because there are reflex pathways, but we're going to kind of basically not talk about the visceral afferent, but I want to mention just, while we're at it, why we're not talking about it and look at the difference between the afferent division and the efferent division. But, this visceral sensory receptors, those interoceptors embedded in your heart and the smooth muscle, of your guts and stuff like that, your glands monitoring all your internal body stuff. They're picking up stuff. They're coming in they're going through the dorsal root ganglia, and they came in and they go up to their pathway, and they're usually in areas like your brainstem and your hypothalamus that are going to kind of process that information unconsciously. Whereas stuff we're pretty much aware of, and all this is kind of loose. This is just basically, it's not 100%, but stuff you're aware of, right? Pain, touch, heat, right? All that stuff is coming in through these somatic sensory neurons. And then they'll go up, they'll go through the thalamus, and then they'll up at that primary somatosensory cortex of your cerebrum, right? Your cerebral cortex. So otherwise, though, besides their destination and where they start from, their kind of pathway is very similar for this, right? They're just going to go up, maybe even together, right? Maybe even through the same neurons, so that, as we'll see, when we talked about visceral, the referred pain, right? That's one reason why when you're having a heart attack, you feel it in your skin sometimes because some of these pathways are shared. But for the most part, aware of stuff we aren't aware of. Interoceptors, exteroceptors. For our motor division, somatic versus visceral, we had, that was the afferent. We have the efferent division, and we're going to have motor neurons in the efferent division because they're going out. For somatic, we have some somatic motor neurons controlling skeletal muscle. What do we have on this side? We have visceral motor neurons, and they're controlling smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Right? And this will make up your autonomic nervous system, right, which is going to be divided into two functionally and anatomically distinct: parasympathetic and sympathetic. Cerebral. So let's look at these two pathways once again, right? Again, we're going to start off with the cerebral cortex. In this pathway, we're going to describe it as the descending pathway, right? Going efferent pathway, the motor neurons innervating skeletal muscle. Right? And that's going to be the way we describe these descending motor somatic pathways, right? And the key here at this point is cerebral cortex and skeletal muscle, where it starts, where it finishes. For our visceral pathway, we're going to start off in the hypothalamus and the brainstem, right? Unconscious, lizard, zombie brain stuff. And it's going to go down through descending pathways, same thing. Afferent, same thing. Motor, same thing. Except it's all visceral, right? So the target is going to be smooth muscle and glands. And then the other part of this, which I should have updated here, is a major difference. As we'll see, this pathway is going to be going down, and it's not going to go straight out to the pathway, right? It's going to come out, stop here, go out here, stop again on the outside, and then go to its target, right? So there'll be another major different anatomical difference between somatic versus visceral. So let's just look at that again: somatic versus visceral. So we said oculomotor neuron was controlling these eye muscles. You had the motor nuclei in the brainstem that was getting its commands from the cerebral cortex, and then it was going to contract. So the fibers left, right, out of the brainstem, headed toward the eye in this oculomotor neuron nerve, right? Came out, and it synapse, it split off into those telodendria, but then it connected directly onto those muscles, right? And what did it do there? It secreted acetylcholine right onto the muscle, right, which caused an action potential in these muscles and caused them to contract, right? Acetylcholine directly onto the target tissue right here. That's your somatic. What about your visceral? What's that going to look like? Your visceral is going to come out through those cranial nerve motor nuclei that had a visceral motor centers. Axon is going to leave to whatever the ventral root equivalent of the brainstem is. It's going to go out. It's going to follow along that same nerve, right? But instead of going right to the target, which in this case would be, let's say, those, pupillary muscles, it's going to stop first. It's going to stop in this little blob right here, and it's going to connect in this autonomic ganglia. Remember, the motor nuclei was the cell bodies in the CNS, right? The nuclei controlling that nerve. A ganglia is another group of cell neuron bodies, neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system, right? So this is right near your eyeball right here. So it's a group of cell bodies. And so we're going to call this, if this is the autonomic ganglia, this is the preganglionic neuron and the preganglionic fiber, right, going into this ganglia, right? It's going to talk to this guy, also secrete acetylcholine, as it will turn out, and stimulate him. He The post-ganglionic neuron will then go on to innervate the target. All right. So somatic, direct connection to the target. Visceral is going to make a stop first and talk to someone else within that autonomic ganglia. So that preganglionic neuron fiber will talk to a postganglionic neuron, which will then go on to innervate the target. So there's two motor neurons in this visceral pathway versus your singular somatic one. All right, so that's a big difference between your visceral versus somatic. So this happens to be the general organization of your autonomic nervous system, both sympathetic and parasympathetic. There'll be differences between these, but this is the general organization, right? You're going to have this preganglionic neuron, right, sitting in the brain. If it was a brainstem, it would be that cranial nerve nuclei, and it would extend its axon out through the ventral root. And instead of going right to the target, it's going to stop in this autonomic ganglia, talk to another neuron. That neuron is going to receive that signal and then send its axon out through the periphery until it reaches its target. That target will be some sort of visceral effector organ, right? Maybe the smooth muscle of the tubes, maybe a cardiac muscle, maybe a gland. All right, that's the general organization. Two neurons, one of them is going to be outside the central nervous system. The other thing we'll mention here, and we can go into more detail, but all I'm going to ask you is to say that the preganglionic axon, for some reason, I don't have a great explanation for this, but it's something you'd be asked about. This axon is myelinated, right? The one leaving the central nervous system. It's lightly myelinated, not so much as our somatic ones, but it does have myelination. So it's a very fast signal. And then for some reason, this one over here is unmyelinated. All right, so this one over here would be a little bit slower, right? And there's reasons for this, but I don't really have a good one. So it's just unmyelinated. So it's a little slower, and for probably reasons that it doesn't need to get there that fast because the effects will be a little longer, rather than your skeletal muscle, right? Which you need to make like these constant, very, very fast and precise movements, right? Maybe this doesn't need to be so fast. And whenever your body can save work and energy from myelinating, it does. Right? So that's your organization, right, of your general autonomic nervous system. Right? And we're going to compare. So we just compared the somatic motor pathway, single motor neuron, going to talk to a target, which will be a skeletal muscle, right, voluntarily controlled. CNS will be your cerebral cortex, right, your primary motor cortex, your frontal lobe. Then your target will be an effector, and there'll be a single neuron leaving the spinal cord or brainstem and reaching out to the target. For autonomic pathways, there's going to be two neurons for the most part, with one single kind of exception, and that are going to talk to another neuron in these ganglia over here. And the targets will be smooth cardiac muscle, endocrine and exocrine glands, and some adipose tissue. What I was saying was the difference between the two, somatic and visceral, and then we'll see a difference between the two divisions of your autonomic, right, parasympathetic and sympathetic. But in either case, right, we had centrally located preganglionic motor neurons, right, located in specific areas, right? In the case of your brainstem, like your cranial nerve number 10, it was located in nuclei, right? In your brainstem motor neurons over here, and then they'd send out their axons, right, to do whatever, right? Actually, this one would go down, right? Whereas your lateral horn was the location in your spinal cord of your visceral motor neurons that would send out their axons to do their stuff, right? These would be the pre-ganglionic neurons, right? Because they'll connect with the post-ganglionic neurons. So for our cranial nerves, right, those are all located up in the brainstem. They sent their axons out and they went to those autonomic ganglia, the parasympathetic ganglia. And then those neurons are the ones that did things like make your eye tear, make you secrete saliva, constrict your pupil, or do all this stuff over here, right? So that, all these are going to be your cranial nerves, which are going to be part of your parasympathetic pathway, right? So that'll be all covered with these cranial nerve, which ones? 3, 7, 9, 10, right? Going out to do all that. But your parasympathetic also includes, leaving the brainstem here, we'll go all the way down the spinal cord with no motor neurons until we get to the very end right here. And from S2 to S3, that is the sacral region, sacral segments of your spinal cord are going to have those preganglionic fibers, right, which will go out again through the ventral root and innervate the targets, right? So the fact that this is coming from your cranial region, your sacral region, means that we can call, instead of the parasympathetic, maybe an anatomically correct way to describe this is the craniosacral division. So that is another way to call the parasympathetic one, right? On the other hand, in between here with no parasympathetic ones are all your sympathetic, the other division. And they're all from T1, thoracic segment 1, down to lumbar segment 2. So these are called your thoracolumbar division, right? That is your sympathetic. That is all the preganglionic fibers are sitting within from T1 to L2. And they'll send their preganglionic fibers out to talk to their respective postganglionic fibers, right? So craniosacral, thoracolumbar divisions, right? These are the two. So we'll talk a little bit about the craniosacral first, a little bit